HTRI, ISSA, T-STAR, Electronic Systems Engineering Technology, and of course the Grand Staff Leader. And then today we have Dr. Pablo Tarazaga. I said that right earlier and I said it wrong up here. But if you can give him a round of applause and a warm welcome.
All right, well, thank you. I don't know, I try to sit and do this, I'm not sure. I'm a professor, so I usually want to wander around and get close to people, so this is kind of interesting. But anyway, first of all, thank you for having me over. I'm happy to share with you a little bit of the stuff that we're doing in our lab and some of the work that we do in this kind of a realm of intelligent or smart infrastructure, or also called Internet of Things in certain domains. And I'll share with you kind of these high-level pictures and story about how we got started and some of the research that's come out of it, and hopefully it'll cause some nice conversation. So I titled this talk, Have You Talked to Your Building? And this idea that, we've talked about smart cars and smart watches and smart everything, but we rarely talk about this idea of smart infrastructure or this interaction with buildings. So about 10 years ago, we started a big project at Virginia Tech, and we instrumented a building, and that kind of led us to a lot of the things that you can see today. So with that, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a professor at Texas A&M in the Mechanical Engineering Department. I'm also the Associate Department Head for Research and Strategic Initiatives, which means more work for the same amount of pay. It's great. But there we go. Anyway, so I direct something called the FAST Lab, which is the Fusion of Analysis, Simulations, and Testing Lab. And so what it is we do a lot of modeling, we do a lot of simulation, and we do a lot of testing, and we really like those things to come together, which means we're always disappointed. But no, just kidding. So we like to validate our models, and we like to make sure that we're capturing the right set of things. The main areas I work on are those kind of 4 bullet points: vibrations, adaptive structures. So vibrations is kind of self-explanatory, oscillations of structures, and so on. Adaptive structures are structures that can actually change their properties and adapt to their environment. And there's a lot of examples of that, but morphing aircraft are probably one of the most popular ones lately that you get to see in the news. We do a lot of testing, and so a lot of the things that we test are very hard to test, are very difficult to test, and so we develop new testing methodologies. And we do a lot of signal processing of that data we gather, and we do a lot of sensor development. And here's kind of a big picture of the stuff that has happened in my lab for the past, I would say, decade. And so we've done things like, modeling the hair cells inside your ear that do transduction, which basically turns acoustic energy into electrical impulses in your ear. So it turns out when you go to one of your famous football games, you're exceeding the capacity of your ears and you're losing these little hair cells. And so maybe one day we'll come back in and shove them back in with these special piezoelectric hairs that can mimic that behavior. And we've worked all the way to instrumentation of buildings, high-energy laser weapon systems, and additive manufacturing, so a lot of quality control and some of that stuff. And so I actually see vibrations absolutely everywhere I work, and it's very easy for me to bring in my expertise into those areas. And so we get to play with all kinds of different projects. And what we're going to focus today is basically the right-hand side of this slide, which is this idea of building instrumentation and all the consequences that has. And so, how this got started for me is we had the opportunity to instrument the entire building at Virginia Tech. So I had moved into my new job as this building was being built, and I convinced the higher-ups that I wanted to put sensors in this building. I had just come from putting 200 sensors in England on a helicopter, and I said, hey, why can't I do the same thing to a building? And so it turns out that we ended up putting something around 225 accelerometers underneath the floor. We had to connect all those accelerometers, so we ordered 65,000 feet of cable, which when you order 65,000 feet of cable, you get to choose it in hokey orange. And so you get whatever color you want when you order that much cable. And we partnered with a lot of companies to get the sensors and get the data acquisitions and so on. And so that spurred what we called the Virginia Tech Smart Infrastructure Laboratory. And what was very interesting about this lab is that I put together this very diverse team. We had mathematicians, we had people in psychology that did behavioral science, We had people in the library who did data repository. And so we ended up having to build a really interesting team in order just to understand and capture the data that we were swallowing from this building. So it ended up causing some really nice synergies. Just to paint a picture of what this looks like, the little gray dots are accelerometers that we distributed throughout the building. Those dots then had cable all the way to 5 data acquisition systems in the building, and those data acquisition systems then were connected to our own internal network. And just some numbers, it was a 160,000 square foot building. It had this standalone system. We had 5 distributed DACs. We had 225 sensors. We could collect about 4 gigabytes of data an hour. Although at some points when we were sampling higher, we could collect 10 gigabytes in a minute, depending on what we were trying to sample at. We had 2 transparent switches to make sure that what we were collecting across this entire domain was synchronized, right? We really wanted to know what was happening at the same time. Local, storage of about 100 terabytes to store this data. And so when you turn the system on, it kind of looks something like this. A whole bunch of channels getting a whole bunch of data that oscillates around 0. And what we've learned over time is that these bleeps actually have a lot of information. The first one is actually doors opening and closing. The next one is a person approaching a sensor. Later on at the bottom here, what you see is an HVAC system turning on. And so that led us to start to want to ask a lot of questions, right? We had intentionally instrumented the building with this idea of doing structural health monitoring. How's the building doing? What happens to a building during an earthquake? If we model a building, does it resemble what we said it was going to behave at? And so we started to, think about this. How do we make sense of all this information, right? And it's not something that maybe a mechanical engineer knows how to do very well necessarily. So that's where a lot of the teams came out. And so since it's a small crowd, maybe we can do some interactions. What comes to mind, right? What ideas come to mind when you think about this data? What can you do with this data? I'm a professor, so I can wait awkwardly in silence here. Go ahead. Front row here.
Figure out if the still-in 3D printer was actually still in after hours or just locked during hours.
All right, so maybe we can see activity around the building. Somewhere back there?
I was just gonna say personnel tracking.
Okay, very good. Anything else? In the back?
Motor failure.
Rotor failure? Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And that's what I was saying, just like, maybe, like if they had that in Miami during that building collapse, they might have.
Right, we might have seen that coming. Yeah, back there?
You can negotiate lower insurance premiums if you have a safe building.
Oh, there you go. Oh, absolutely. Right. So we started to ask a lot of those questions. To be honest, we never set out to do that. I set out to do structural health monitoring, and when we turned on that system, one of our channels completely flooded. Like the data was just, very aggressive. And we said, well, we know where the sensor is, why don't we show up and go look at that sensor? And when we get there, someone was drilling into the wall. And what we were seeing was the RPM of the drill, being captured by the sensor. And that kind of said, oh my God, what can we do now? And so, that led to a lot of questions. I get a lot of nervous people in the audience usually, because this means that I know a lot about the building. And one of the best questions I get is related to this, right? You always wonder if Alexa and Siri are always listening, right? And the truth is that they are always listening. And so we were listening to the building all the time. So then we started to think about what are the first things we could do? And we said, well, we know what oscillations look like, which is this top figure. And as we got further and further from the sensor, from the event that was making that oscillation at the very top, we saw that there was no oscillation. So we said, can we just do some heat maps? Can we just map circles around the building that are correlated to the activity? And what we started to see was that this is starts at 7 a.m., there's a class at 8 a.m., and everybody's coming in through the doors and congregating on the right-hand side. And it's going every 2 or 3 minutes. And we started to notice that we could tell where people were going, and we can tell which students were late to class. Then we started to correlate across the day, and we could see, of course, at lunchtime, the greatest amount of activity. People were leaving the building or coming in around lunch, right? And maybe not everybody was coming back. So those are other questions for maybe the department heads, not necessarily the general public. But anyway, so that started to ask a lot of questions. It's like, well, can we look at maybe more holistic things? Can we look at the building as an entirety and then work our way in? And so we started with the first thing that we set out to do, which was building infrastructure behavior. And what you'll see here is an earthquake that happened in Chiapas, Mexico, so 1,600 miles away, crossed the ocean and arrived at Virginia Tech. And when it arrived, it made the building do this. Of course, it's been exaggerated for visual purposes. Clearly, you don't want an office in that corner right there. That's a lot of vibrations. But what was, yeah, go ahead.
Do you trust that the delta between one sensor and another and the results it gave you, is it fine enough that you can actually trust this visual?
So those sensors are very, very accurate, right? Very, very high sensitivity. I would trust them very, very well. Relative motions and stuff like that then get harder and so on. But this is building behavior. Of course, again, exaggerated for visual purposes so you can see it. And then we process that data and we can tell you actually how the building breaks down into its constituent, what we call mode shapes. So every structure has mode shapes and it only moves as a combination of those. And so we saw that as well in the data that we could see. So it was very interesting to see, could we track this over time? Could we see the onset of a building failing by tracking these modes and seeing them degrade or move from where they're supposed to be? Because buildings don't usually get better now that there's equipment. Question over here?
Yeah, how did you know that it was that event that caused the shaking? I mean,
right. So there's a lot of things such as we're on a tectonic plate, so it has to be a serious event for us to see it at Virginia Tech. We had ground sensors who also caught it across the state, and we also have an estimate of the speed of that wave, and so we can kind of back calculate and track it.
I mean,
across
there
the
could have been
states.
20 earthquakes around the world. Why wasn't it one of those?
Because it was a few seconds with the speed that these waves propagate through Earth, so it made perfect sense. We didn't have anything else according to the USGS around the area at the time in that magnitude.
Okay.
So I mean, you have to start filtering things, right? It could have been a couple of things. Maybe someone ran into the building with a truck.
Fine.
And,
I'm just
right,
curious as to how you detect something.
right. You have to start. Yeah, you have to start parsing the data and looking at the events. And we're connected to the USGS, so we know the activities that are being tracked, and as best as we can.
Okay.
Did you have another question? It's gonna take more than 30 minutes with this.
So, do you have an image of what that would look like on a normal day?
On a normal day,
Exact
almost
same.
imperceivable
Exactly.
compared to this. Yeah. Mhm.
Okay, that's really cool.
Yeah. Yeah, those are good questions. I'm just showing you like one random
Yeah,
moment,
no,
right?
that's,
Could you see like large vehicles driving by the building?
Only not from, say, the top sensors in the building. You can see it more from the ground sensors, right? They won't induce something that correlates to building motion at the top.
The garbage truck shows up every Monday morning.
Oh yeah, we can see that. So actually, we're going to get to the other studies, but we were seeing activity at night in the building that made no sense to us. And so we would see the energy in the building and the sensors. If we looked at energy in the sensors, it would all spike around 2 a.m. and then it would die at 6 a.m. And we thought we were going crazy. And then we found out that the building had hired the cleaning service private, and they were coming in at those times. And so, for example, we saw that. If you would have asked me ahead of time, I could have told you what it was, but then we kind of correlated it to that, right? So anyway, so that was kind of a big perspective, and then we said, okay, can we, instead of just looking at building, can we start to look further in? And the idea of, vibration-based occupant inference kind of showed up in our language, and it's this idea of a Marauders map, right? If you've seen Harry Potter, you open the Marauders map and you kind of track the different people at the school according to their footsteps. And so that was kind of one of our aims, was could we start to do something like this? So the basic questions were, can we localize events? Then could we classify the events? And then could we say something about what induced the event? And so those are kind of higher levels of making inferences of not only the building, but what is actuating the building, and then what is that actuation itself. So they increase in complexity. So we did a lot of studies. One of them is the idea of these models. So you might not think of it, but when you walk on a structure, you generate waves like ripples on a pond. And our sensors are very sensitive to pick up those ripples. And the idea is that you can use those ripples to figure out where the event happened. And as a matter of fact, you're using that right now to find me on stage. You're either using it with your eyes or you're using it with your ears. You're doing triangulation. right? You're doing time of arrival techniques to find me. And so the idea was if we have enough sensors, could we start to do that? And that requires a lot of testing. So here's one of my graduate students blowing off some steam by hitting the structure and measuring the responses and building some models. And then our first attempt, which wasn't great at all, was us, what we were supposed to be is tracking a person across the hallway. And as you can see, this person is going through walls with every step, and it doesn't make sense. So those are our initial models. But we got better, and after like 4 PhD theses, what we arrived at is the red is ground truth, is where we know the person stepped. And the blue triangle you're going to see is us looking at the sensor data alone and back calculating where that step happened. And that is about a 1 meter accuracy in a 160,000 square foot building. Right, so this is us tracking that person. And the sensors you see, some go greener and some are lighter. So we're also weighing the sensors that are closer to make those decisions. And these are basically time difference of arrival, time of arrival techniques to try to make those decisions. And so, like everything, we get greedier and greedier. And we said, okay, well, can I start to learn something about what caused the vibrations? And so what we started to do was actually looking at footsteps and trying to reconstruct the information from those footsteps. And what you see here in these figures, which there's a lot to talk about, but we'll stick to the basics, is when you hit the ground reacts in this oscillatory fashion. That is this blue line and this red line. And it turns out that the data is very susceptible to when you start to use the data to gather information from it. So things as simple as alignment of signals will cause huge improvements in what you're trying to infer. And what we did is we walked a whole bunch of people down a corridor, and we put them in a matrix, and we did a single value decomposition. But the important thing about that is that the single value decomposition tells us how unique that data set is. And it turns out that that data set is very unique. And it led to things like we could classify shoes about 100% accurate. We could classify subjects 96%, but we could classify gender. So basically, we knew when you were walking down the hallway who you were. And so that led to a lot of interesting questions, and maybe some controversial ones too, was, well, what can we do with this? And there was ideas of potential applications, right? There's security and threat detection. As people here, they're not supposed to be here. And maybe like if you've seen one of the latest Mission Impossibles where he walks down the corridor and they're filming him and doing all this stuff, we gather your information, and once you're in the building, we can track you, right? Things of that nature. Hospitals started to reach out to us because they said, hey, we want to track where people are. We want to, maneuver traffic in different ways so that there's less sharing of COVID and stuff like that. We heard about Nordstrom had some issues because they were tracking people's cell phones to know where people were going, and they were splitting that by gender to know, where men went, where women went, and how they could rearrange their stores. And they got into a lot of trouble because the phones were very much linked to you. And so this technology is interesting in the sense that it's scalable in terms of its invasion of privacy, right? If you walk in, I maybe can just, differentiate you by gender, but I don't know who you are. And that maybe is all that Nordstrom needs to know. But if you go to the Pentagon, we'll have you walk through this corridor, and that will tag that gate to you, right? So you have a way of, controlling that invasion of privacy if you want. And then there's things like, HVAC control, energy efficiency, and so on. And so we thought maybe there was something more to these signals, and maybe there's a potential that there's a fingerprint here in your gate, right? And that's a big question that we're probably decades away from answering. With that came the idea if there were any specific gait information about this, right? So could there be information about, how fast you walk, how big is your stride, or if you lean right or if you lean left, which could have a lot of health implications. And so I'm trying to speed up a little bit, but basically what you see in these histogram graphs in yellow is, how much you lean to the right or to the left. And what you see on the right-hand side is, your stride and your speed have correlations. And so there's a lot of information that's linked to your stride changing right before you're about to fall. And in older adults, this is a very, very big issue, right? If you have grandparents, you know this. And about 60% of older adults who fall die within 6 months. So it's a very important thing. And so there's issues here about, having life alert and older adults not pushing the button, even when they've been on the floor for 6 to 12 hours and eventually actually die of pneumonia. And so there's also an issue about compliance, right? I have the sensor, I don't want to touch it, versus the building has the sensor, it makes the decision for me, right? And we can talk about policy and all those issues as well.
Could you detect a person falling?
Yes, so we're going to get there. That's a very hard question because it turns out you can't invite people over and trip them. So we're still trying to figure out how to do that. But here are, for example, gate measurements of different gates, right? Parkinsonian gate, hemiplegic gate, a slap gate, and all of these are linked to conditions. There's also a lot of things to say here about rehabilitation, right? Or sports medicine, when you're trying to bring someone back to its original condition. So instead of perceptive ways, you can actually have quantitative ways of looking at these gates, which are interesting. And so that happens by, taking information like you see here in the red and blue, which are basically steps that show you very clearly that one person is hitting the ground harder than with the other one.
I'm sorry, could you go back? I want to see the no shoe. That's awesome.
Yeah, so we learned a lot about stilettos. My students wanted me to try them on. Anyway, other stories maybe after the scotch. But anyway, so it's very fun to see how the gates differ by different conditions. We're still trying to parse a lot of this, but when you look at these gates, right, if you have a normal gate, you also have equivalent energy, you have equivalent energy per foot, and then if you start to have things like a slap gate, right, you'll have more energy on one side than the other. And so, for example, you could imagine running a diagnostics on grandma when she wakes up from bed and goes to the bathroom, and then doesn't have to come into the doctor, doesn't have to get out of her comfort zone and actually improves, independence, right? Big question, a lot of ifs. Like I said, we'd love to do falls, but it turns out it's very hard to hire people and then trip them, especially older adults. So you have to start getting creative. These are my
students. Grant money to pay off the IRB.
There you go, grant money to pay off the IRB. In case my boss is listening, no. But anyway, so we were trying to get creative about different ways, flying off a chair, flying off. And we actually have a proposal right now to actually put mannequins off the ground in certain positions that are actually more full, that they look more like falls, right? And what happens is those look like someone just got drunk and tipped over, right? Maybe you want to know that too. But anyway, so we're trying to find ways. We actually started to work with actors who actually practice falling and seeing if there was maybe some correlations there. But you can see very clearly that here's in that video what you saw. You saw a fall simulation, a chair falling over, a door closing, and a book dropping. Very different, right? So can we train now machine learning algorithms and just to do this? It's actually not that hard. So the question, there's a lot of research questions about what to do here. And maybe to try to wrap things up, here we've also done gunshots. And so I was a student during the massacre at Virginia Tech, so this has kind of a very interesting correlation to my life there. And so, and I'll put it all together in a nice story at the very end. We took a platform with sensors out to a shooting range, we did shots, and we actually did a comparison between the signature collected by the sensors. And it turns out we can identify the guns. We have almost a 98%, I think, accuracy in detecting caliber. And those could be information that you start to put together from everything you've seen today, right? And so
you say identify gun, like you can tell if it's a pistol or a rifle, or you can tell which model.
We can tell the caliber.
Which model of pistol.
We can take caliber, right? If you put the data into the algorithm and you have some data set, right, you can start to parse the data sets out.
That's still very useful because when the SWAT team shows up, they would like to know.
Exactly. So you're beating me to my end punch, but here we go. No, very good. So there's a lot of questions that are raised here, right? There's an importance of domain knowledge, understanding what is it that you're measuring and how is it being filtered through a structure altogether. Idea of developing reduced order models because you don't really want to collect this data at this rate and then you want to be able to process it. We've noticed that the same data, what was rich about these sensors, provided building dynamics as much as classification of participants and occupants, right? And it was the same sensors running at the same time over the whole system. And so there's a huge time scale which allows you to move between one important set of information in the data and another important set. So there's kind of something fun there to do. There's a problem with scalability and can we transfer this to another building, and then what does that mean at that building? Do we have to do a whole bunch of new tests? So a lot of questions to answer, but one of the things that we put together was kind of what happens if you put all this together? And we have this scenario. So say this is Goodwin Hall, the building that we were doing at Virginia Tech, and something happens, right? So we have an incident is identified in the building, right? And then what happens is the building goes, oh, it's right here. And maybe it can identify and classify what's happened. So the building itself could deploy countermeasures, right? It could close doors, it could open doors for evacuation, but it could close doors very localized to the problem if it needed to, right? It could, so that's what it's saying there, right? It can inform through your cell phones what's going on, right? And the building could call law enforcement, right? It could say, hey, I have an intruder, it's detected, right? 3rd floor, male, 190 pounds, and discharged 9mm. And that's all with the information that we showed in a few slides ago. So you can do all of that in a matter of seconds if an incident like this happened. And it's currently tracking the person, right? And then the police could show up and say, inform the occupants and divert them away from the intruder. Then you could have lockdown on the 3rd floor, but open the other floors for evacuation. The police arrives, and you can provide the police an update on their tablet or their phone that shows them exactly where they need to go. Then it could tell them what is the fastest entry point, right? And then it could follow the police as it approaches the incident and inform the rest of the people, right? So that's kind of a futuristic idea of what you could do if you started to put all these little stories that I just showed together at the end, right? Of course, I'd like to thank my team. I don't do this by myself. My students carry most of the load, and so do my sponsors that help me do this work. And I'll stop there, and I'll entertain questions. And if you have any other questions, you can always email me. And I'm always a sucker for coffee, as it says.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
We got time for maybe 3 or 4 questions.
Any?
Can you retrofit buildings with these sensors, or do they have to be installed during construction?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So when we did this, we wanted to go the highest standard we could accomplish, right? So we didn't want wireless sensors. We wanted wired. We wanted connected to the structural components, so we had the maximum range of sensitivity. So we were shooting for the best possible case. The next question I usually get is how much does this cost? In a building like this, it costs 1 to 2% of the building cost. And so this is kind of, I would say, the gold standard. Fully wired, separate network, highest quality sensors we could get. We've developed a portable system that could do a couple of rooms for about $100. And it would plug into an outlet, and you would, glue it to the floor. But of course, it might need some calibrations. You might, if it's a very shaky floor, I don't know. We still have to explore that. Back there?
Yeah, so you said it has to structural members, but then you talked about gluing to the floor. So is that the first test building, how did you connect those sensors?
So this building, what we did is we have the I-beams, and we went underneath the I-beams, and then on top of the I-beams you have the slab, right? And so they're kind of far apart from where the action is happening from, say, footsteps. But they're also in the main members because we wanted to look at building dynamics. Putting sensors in a building is a challenge because we had to scrape off fire retardant foam. We had to connect these special beams that would stick out of the fire retardant foam. Then the fire marshal had to come back and approve that. But what we found out through the entire process is that everybody wanted to do it, including us. So the construction company wanted to do it, the fire marshal wanted to do it, and so we found solutions. We had to iterate a lot to comply with code and all that kind of stuff. And we can talk a little bit about it, but we made these standoffs that were welded to the I-beams that they can bring back fire retardant foam, and then we can put our sensors on top. So yeah, and I'm not saying that that's the only way. We've also done them on top, but we also didn't want people to see them or step on them or steal them. So there's other considerations as well.
What is the outcome you would like to produce in the next 12 months based on all this?
Well, right now we're trying to improve localization. We think we need to improve it in order to move from 1 or 2 people tracking to tracking, 50 people entering a room. And that problem is very complex. And different people might want different answers to that. Like if you're doing HVAC, you might want to know what the average number is. But if you're doing security, you might want to know the person in the crowd. And so we're trying to tackle one of those problems right now, which is to improve our localization and individual tracking in a crowd. Sorry, did that answer your question back there?
Yeah, I mean, mostly, I'm sure there's a lot of challenges. And when you're going into the floor, I mean, I'm assuming you had to put a divot in there or something, glue over it or something.
So if I put, so the requirement of a sensor of this nature attachment is linked to how high in bandwidth you want to go. And since footsteps are only sub 200 hertz, you can actually just place the sensor on the floor and it'll work, right? Something as simple as using wax to push it in will give you good enough data, right? Probably not what you want long term to stay there. So a lot of these guys have like a 1032 screw hole, and you just make a 1032 and you screw them into the floor, right? But the requirements are based on maybe the bandwidth you want and how permanent you want it. Any more?
So in essence, you can provide everything from, in a school, let's say, shot detection system, tracking and so on, but also predictive maintenance, HVACs, or even some of the other equipment that maybe can be used.
Right. So I mean, we borrowed a lot of this stuff from structural health monitoring, right? Which goes on to systems like that, right? You put a couple of these guys near an HVAC system, and you get an unbalance, or you get something, it's going to show up in the data. And we had in the HVAC systems on the roof, we had about 20 sensors around those systems as well to monitor them and know when they were turning on and off and stuff like that. It was a hard relationship with Siemens though.
Well, thank you very much. Again, thank you, Pablo.
Thank you.
A short announcement, we're gonna take a break during the summer for a month or two, depending on how many people stay in town. But we're gonna be planning an AI, artificial intelligence forum in the fall. So if you're interested in participating on that, let me know.
Too late.
We're gonna be, the fall will be today. So this is our second artificial intelligence. Okay, thank you very much. We'll go get a whiskey here in a second.
Yeah, thank you.